Texas is one of the wealthiest and most powerful states in the US, consistently ranking in the top 5 and often top 3 of many such metrics. However, this was not predestined. Texas got its start as a filibuster state, wherein white colonists settled the Mexican state of Tejas before revolting for their independence due to the centralization of power under Santa Anna, and also slavery. The independent Republic of Texas was very eager to join the US, but this remained highly controversial within America itself. But this of course begs the question, what if Texas had remained independent? To start with, how do we go about this if the electorate was so keen on annexation? It's actually somewhat simple, but it's still a twofold process. Firstly, we need Sam Houston to either retire or die after his first term in office. While the pro-annexation faction would likely still have an advantage, this means they don't have nearly as central a rallying figure. Houston was basically the George Washington of Texas, at least until 1860, and removing him from politics earlier likely allows a little breathing room for the nationalist faction. Houston got almost 70% of the vote in his re-election campaign, and even if another pro-annexation candidate would likely win in 1841, the odds aren't in their favor to make it quite that high. In 1844, Anson Jones would win a solid but highly reduced margin of 55.2 to 44.4. Regardless, if the pro-annexation faction still wins in 41 and 44, what's the difference? Well, for that we need to turn to America. The annexation of Texas remained highly controversial in the US, and both the Democrats and Whigs were generally skeptical. However, President John Tyler was the driving factor behind annexation and used just about every trick in the book to see it through. Technically, the US never even ratified a treaty of annexation with Texas, just a House resolution. So how do we prevent Tyler's presidency? Simple. We have William Henry Harrison serve that term instead. Harrison was elected in 1840, gave the longest inaugural speech in American history, got pneumonia, and died due to the bad drinking water in the White House. If we present Harrison's death, then the US doesn't have the expansionist Tyler in office, and can't work to push the debate as much as he did. So what does a Harrison administration actually look like? Well, Harrison was a supporter of parliamentarianism, which in the US means believing that Congress should be supreme over the president. In addition, as a Whig, he was a big proponent of protectionism and chartering a new national bank, which Jackson had killed. This in fact being blamed for the poor economy of the late 1830s. Harrison's term is actually rather muted, all things considered, since he didn't really want to be this powerful defining president. Regardless, Harrison doesn't pursue annexation, and for the purposes of our video, his successor in 1844 also stays out of it. Harrison pledged not to run for re-election, so I think that some other northern Whig takes over, or perhaps a cotton Whig like Webster. Regardless, the US says no on Texas. Maybe they bully Spain over Cuba or something instead. Also, for once, I don't think this makes the US more protectionist by default, since we're not actively sabotaging the Democrats for 20 to 30 years. Though, there is probably a national bank. Now, as time goes on and it becomes clear the US is not going to annex Texas, support for that position will go down. As a result, we'll see the nationalists emboldened in the Lone Star Republic, but before we get to that, we should probably figure out their government. While based on the US, Texas was a unitary state versus a federal model, meaning that power was much more centralized on the national level. Given that their effective control was more or less the size of France, and political power was concentrated in the white American colonial population, this does make some sense. Regardless, the actual government of Texas was rather similar to most US states. A 3-year presidency without consecutive re-elections, a House of Representatives, and a Senate. However, black people and Native Americans were explicitly barred from citizenship, although, funnily enough, for white immigrants, citizenship was incredibly easy to get. Live in the Republic for 6 months. Bada bing, bada boom. Though this was in all likelihood a consequence of the Republic controlling about half of their claimed territory. Also, the vice president was elected separately from the president, which while I do think is interesting, also makes me think of early America's runner-up system. Regardless, by 1848, I think that hopes of annexation would have given way to pragmatism. The US isn't coming to bail them out of the border dispute and limited recognition with Mexico, nor their large debt. As a result, the Nationalist Party will likely wind up absorbing a lot of the pro-annexation faction, and the emergence of a more cohesive party system will begin. The Nationalists were headed by men like Mirabeau Lamar and David Burnett, and Wikipedia says that they were supposedly nominated by a faction calling themselves the Democrats, but considering that Lamar wanted a national bank, and Jacksonian democracy was defined by not wanting a national bank, this seems unlikely to me. Thus, as the political debate breaks down into questions of finance and Western expansion, we'll have the expansionist pro-bank and tariff party call itself the Texan National Party. In contrast, the pro-American anti-bank faction evolves into the Democrats. Admittedly, this is a little boring, but the fact is Texan political philosophy would be derived from questions in the American South of the time. However, state/district rights aren't necessarily going to be that big a factor in the Republic's politics, since the country is centered on the eastern third of their claims, and power is already heavily centralized in Austin. Now, by the 1850s, the question of Mexico and the Texan Western claims are going to be nearly existential. Mexico never recognized Texas's independence, and without the US coming to take the territory, might be willing to try and force the issue in their favor. However, Texas might be able to garner British and French support. This is a stretch since they have abolished slavery by that point and aren't going to like the idea of saving a slave or republic, but Texas will have spent the entire 1840s trying to ingratiate themselves to the two powers. As a result, and so that this video continues to make sense, we'll assume that Britain is willing to interfere in their favor. However, this will come at a cost. The Texan Constitution protected the slave trade, and Britain will likely want to extort a treaty that forces Texas to end it. Such a question would be fiercely debated, but if Texas has no choice, this may well be the First Amendment to the Texan Constitution. Now, an Anglo-Texan alliance is actually something of a threat to the US, since it allows London to flank both sides of the country, and was Tyler's official motivation for annexing the small republic. While the British mediation of the Texas dispute with Mexico isn't an alliance per se, it does firmly place Austin in their sphere of influence, and position them as a threat to American dominance. As a result, and since it's only a matter of time before a Democrat gets back into the White House, I think that some level of expansionism might come back into vogue. However, the question is where? If we're assuming that Texas loses most of that big chunk of the state in the negotiation with Mexico, there in California seem rather likely to me. Thus, in either 1848 or in 1852, depending on if Harrison's successor won re-election, the Mexican-American War happens more or less over the Texan Great Plains and California. While Mexico has a bit more time to prepare, the US is generally just much stronger, even in its reduced state, and likely wins. However, the US probably just doesn't take everything it did in real life. Slavery's expansion is much less of a concern here due to Texas being in the way, and Americans who want to expand slavery are either going to be advocating for Texan annexation, fringe in the North and increasingly unpopular in Texas, or wars in the Caribbean. Who knows, maybe William Walker's filibuster in Nicaragua is more enticing to the South. Probably still doomed, though. Now, I'm not sure how this plays into the Civil War. While the Union has a bunch of new land and the South is kind of stunted in its ability to spread into the region, the Union itself also had another 10 years without that major expansion. As a result, slavery continued its pre-1840s course and is in gradual decline. While there wouldn't exactly be a lot of abolition in the core of the South, the fact is it's becoming less profitable due to the soil-sucking tendencies of cotton, the British leaning more on other regions for the resource anyway, and the fact that slavery is an expensive investment because you need to directly feed and house them. That last one being a legitimate argument that the South used to defend the practice compared to free labor in the North, by the way. As a result, while there would likely be Southern firebrands who are ready to push as far as California and take over Texas, again, I think that most Southerners would lack the radicalization that the real-life 1840s and 1850s stoked, and it would be in decline. The question then changes from what to do to protect slavery to what to do after the system collapses. With American Cuba, I could see them going for Santo Domingo, like in a reverse of the Reconstruction videos, but more likely, I think, is that they double down on back to Africa plans like Liberia. Slavery might be peacefully and gradually abolished throughout the 1860s, with some sort of freedom of womb amendment passed in some states instead of a typical emancipation. Regardless, this video isn't about America, it's about Texas. According to the 1860 census, about 30.2% of the population was enslaved in the state of Texas. Now, with national borders disincentivizing moving from the US to Texas, that number will be a bit wonky, but the immigrant numbers will also still be high due to the Republic giving immigrants land. Now, by 1864 or so, Texas will begin to face diplomatic issues due to slavery. It's unlikely to be forced to abolish the practice necessarily, but the Union, Mexico, and Britain, its three largest trading partners, will all increasingly be critical, and frankly, they're all more important to Texas than Texas is to them. As a result, I could see moralists from the US and UK pushing for tariffs on Texas, and the country would enter a serious bout of economic malaise. The ramifications of this are impossible to say, but I do think that when nearly 1 in 3 of your population is in bondage like Texas would be, and the population that can work starts having trouble with money, that's a recipe for some serious political unrest through the 1860s and 1870s. Ultimately, Texas would have to amend the Constitution to abolish slavery before the 20th century, but I don't see them doing it before the US. Picking a date somewhat randomly, 1876 seems like a decent guess. However, with the non-consecutive presidency rule as well as the 3-year terms, it almost seems like Texas would evolve into a more or less parliamentary system. Even if the presidency has the same powers as the US, that missing year and limit on re-election pushes a lot of power to Congress, which was by design. As a result, it seems hard for the presidency to really control the powers of government, and these duties need to be channeled elsewhere. While Congress also only served for 1 year, they were at least allowed to run for re-election, and frankly, with a weak presidency, it's either going to go to the VP and the Senate, unelected party bosses controlling the legislature for much longer than 3 years, or someone in the House. This, at least, feels the most democratic out of these options. Regardless, if the 1860s are a period of economic issues, instability in government are the last thing you need, even without the Grover Cleveland presidencies constantly changing party leadership. In terms of partisan makeup, it's kinda hard to say what the 1860s look like for Texas. For example, maybe when slavery becomes a hot-button issue, one of the two parties begins to splinter. and because the country is centered on the part of Texan lands that were actually hospitable to that economic model, it's unlikely to become a sectional issue, but an urban-rural one. Similarly, I could see immigration becoming disliked by the Nationals because of the idea that they're taking from the people who were born there, or the Democrats because of how they view the government and populism being challenged by immigrants. As a result, it's hard to say what the general congressional coalitions look like. Hell, maybe Texas doesn't even really have coalition governments, and it usually legislates by majority. Britain, Canada, and Australia are usually able to pull that off. Something I want to make a note of is that the wealth and political influence in Texas would still be highly concentrated in the white population even after emancipation. If the former Confederacy was able to disenfranchise its African population while the Union was paying attention, what's to stop a former planter economy with a racial order based on those same ideals from getting up to some utterly barbaric shit? In addition, Texas made it clear that free black people couldn't be citizens, and that won't have to change with emancipation. Now, for my Texan viewers, I want to make it clear I'm not saying anything about you, your state, or your modern way of life, but the fact is in the 19th century and most of the 20th, everyone was on this line of white supremacy somewhere. Now, interestingly, the Populist Party in the US actually had its real-life origin in Texas. Starting as the Farmer Alliance in 1877, the movement would grow into a legitimate faction of Texas politics during the 1880s, working with labor groups during that same period, including help orchestrate general strikes. That being said, they also never actually won any major seats in Texas. Not in the House, not in presidential elections, not in the Senate. None of it. As a result, I'm not actually sure what happens to the labor movement in Texas. While they could remain independent and force coalition governments, that does seem like it would prove difficult. However, whether they fuse to the Democrats or the Nationals is unknowable. The American populists largely merged with the Democrats, but they were a big tent party even then. They just had decently malleable social stances that made them okay enough. And no, that is not commentary on anything whatsoever. Sorry for the very quick interruption, but if you're enjoying the show, please consider a like and subscribe for more alternate history content like it every week. During the 1880s and 1890s, the nation is likely caught up in the battle for Caribbean influence that the US was having with Britain. Texas, however, will land firmly in the American camp. It's surrounded by the states, even more so due to Cuba, and the American economy will have a huge influence on the matters of Texas. However, I think that Texas, knowing this, will want to preserve its independence at this point, and could wind up signing an actual alliance with Britain, who will be much more willing to entertain the question a good 20 to 30 years after Texas abolished slavery. They'll probably be skeptical of a potential war with America, but this would be more for allowing Britain some diplomatic weight in the New World in the first place, rather than a serious defensive pact. In any conflict in North America, Texas would get steamrolled and the world knows it. As a result, the country is more or less Finlandized, nominally independent of the superpower neighbor, but not really in a position to take hostile actions against them in terms of foreign policy. So, just like every other Caribbean nation relative to the US, something Roosevelt corollary and good neighbor policy. Now, the first decade of the 20th century will be a high point of an independent Texas. After all, it is about to strike one of the largest oil deposits in the Americas. And now it gets to set its own trade policy. Thank you very much. Again, with the practical exception of America. But that is still a massive boon compared to a state in a larger federation finding a major resource. Texan industry will soar throughout the era, likely emboldening the Nationals on the right, while still keeping the labor question in the air politically. Incidentally, because the US might not take the entirety of California, their own oil industry is relatively reduced. Central California does still have a good bit, but a lot of the heaviest deposits are in parts of the Southern California that might still be part of Mexico in this timeline. Sparsely populated and underutilized parts of Mexico, but parts of Mexico nonetheless. Jumping ahead a bit to World War I, Texas might not get dragged in immediately, but very few nations were spared the horrors of the conflict. Now, I'm going to be a bit conservative with my estimations of foreign events. Realistically, World War I is heavily altered due to the lack of an American Civil War bare minimum, but any particular details on that would be well past the scope of this video. As for Texas itself at this point, who knows? Maybe this time Mexico thought they could take the rump republic while Britain was distracted and America had their head in the sand. While that could get us some funky trench warfare on North America, it's actually pretty unlikely, especially if Mexico still had their revolution around this point. What's more likely is that Texas is simply dragged into the war due to obligations with Britain, which probably pisses off the Texan people given the alliance was more or less ceremonial a mere year prior. Regardless, Texas is very much a small country punching well above its weight in terms of economic contribution. It only had about 3 to 4 million people, making it smaller than even Belgium. But with all that oil and the fact that it's not occupied, it will be able to sell plenty to Britain and likely send a few small divisions. Realistically, they're probably sent off to the Western Front, but any more detail is entirely arbitrary. After the war, I think that Texas might have a bit of Italy syndrome. Not so much that they were cheated out of promised gains and their victory was mutilated, but more, what did they gain? They were press-ganged into one of the most horrific conflicts imaginable, all the way across the sea, all to support an empire most people don't care about, and to make their own local fat cats richer. However, as long as the economy is good, most people are willing to move past that whole mess and enjoy the roaring 20s as the country gets some paychecks from Britain and France. It'd be a shame if the world's largest economy, the only major trade partner Texas has left, and their most important neighbor had a crippling economic crash, and the weeks put historically high tariffs on the entire world, though. Hey, wait a minute. Yeah, Texas is going to have a real tough time with the Depression. While they might get hit with lower tariffs than most other countries, that is entirely due to their position in regards to oil. Otherwise, they'll be thrown into an economic nosedive because of American influence. And this, combined with the resentment the electorate has toward the establishment anyway, is going to cause serious problems for the Republic. Oh, and the whole thing with the African Texan. And the potential disenfranchisement of the Tejano/Latino population for good measure. So, what happens to Texas at this point? Nationalist politicians will call for a break from Britain, while leftists call for an attack on the capitalist class. Honestly, I could very well see a Texan civil war. Even after 1929, nearly a third of the population remains non-citizens, and the economic crisis is going to make people desperate, and demagogues on the left and right are going to have a field day. While the Great Depression is not going to cause a civil war in the US, the fact is that Texas is hit even harder than the US because it loses nearly all of its trade with those tariffs the Americans just passed. Not almost all its trade with the US, I mean almost all its trade. There's no way that Britain can make up the deficit. And if they do, then it'll look like how they did it in Argentina, where they used the country's diminished fortunes to basically make it into an economic vassal. And the yearly elections of the Congress will make this worse, because people will be able to vote in people demanding change immediately. These governments will create unstable coalitions unable to fix everything quickly, and the cycle will repeat. And while the 1932 election in the United States would probably see the reduction of tariffs pretty quickly, the damage would likely be done to Texas. Eventually, by the 1934 election, something may well give. While 5 years is a pretty fast timeline for this kind of deterioration, Texas's economy is so bad and its year-long term so fast that it wouldn't take much for faith in the system to break. Be it an election being contested, or even a strongman demanding constitutional reform and accidentally breaking the election. Or not so accidentally breaking the election. Now, who wins the Texan Civil War? Honestly, it's kind of up in the air, but for now, let's say that it's some generic military junta. Maybe for spice, they're on the nationalist side and want to actually claim the 1836 borders against Mexico and the US. But this would be almost entirely empty rhetoric. Such a state is likely as pro-American as ever, but actively needs to force through serious economic modernization and autarky in order to promote an independent economy. They likely spend most of the 1940s to 1960s doing that. There are likely still elections and opposition parties, but the Congress of Texas will find most of its power in the hands of a generalissimo, though on paper this is likely under the guise of a rejuvenated presidency. However, Texas is now in a prime position for a communist revolution, or at least as much of a prime position as Cuba was in our timeline. While its economy would recover from the Civil War by the 1960s, it would likely still have a very top-down structure. Military juntas are not exactly known for their fantastic wealth distribution, especially in small oil-rich countries like Texas. However, because of a land border with the United States, any communist rise to power would have to be more of a coup than a normal civil war and masses storming the country. A coup also allows for the USSR to have boots on the ground already, so as to prevent the Americans from having opinions. Now, I know. The words Texan and communist go together like oil and water. But, to break the fourth wall a little bit, while Texas would be completely viable as a nation, it wouldn't be a world power. It doesn't have the population, and in this world it lacks a lot of the size and economy that it would have had as part of the US. Due to the size of its neighbors, especially the Americans, it would always get passed from sphere of influence to sphere of influence, and usually be a proxy of the Americans. If we didn't pull Texas into the Soviet sphere, the most it would do is join NATO and basically act as America's second, more conservative Canada. So while it's probably not the most realistic thing in the world, I think that the People's Republic of Texas is the best way to keep the scenario actually interesting. Now, I don't want to turn Texas into Cuba either, even though you just know that a Texan missile crisis happens. The PRT is probably one of the most nationalist parts of the Soviet bloc, defining itself in opposition to the US, emphasizing how America has exploited them like it has many Caribbean and Latin American countries. In addition, communist rule in Texas would probably be the point where its minority population would see more civil rights, at least de jure. In practice, this is probably still a heavily racialized society, though, since most revolutions and military states aren't great at establishing minority rights. I also think that Texas might be a little more democratic than most of the Soviet bloc. Even within the prior junta, Texas still had some democratic elements, and any legitimacy would require them. As a result, whatever form the legislation takes, there's likely an elected figurehead there. From certain parties only, of course, while the military-backed executive holds the real power. The US probably doesn't embargo Texas, even if trade drops off a cliff again. After all, there's too much oil in the region to really not allow any commerce. In addition, with a land border, multiple states will have Texan refugees and communities that probably don't want their homeland on the shit list, both from the Civil War and Communist Revolution. As a result of this, when the Soviet Union falls and the Texan economy goes with it, America will be happy to pick up the slack and prop it up, similar to what it did for countries like Poland and Czechia. As a result, the Second Republic of Texas is welcomed into the North American community and probably NAFTA. With the end of the Cold War, Texas enjoys freedom once again, and the country is welcomed back into the West. The history of Texas in this world is messy. Never meant to be a great power, it was thrust between empires, most aggressively the US. However, Britain and the Soviets both had their history in exploiting the region for their resources, stoking anti-American sentiment in the country. As the 21st century arrives, Texas finds itself a fairly wealthy and industrialized society with a renewed democratic experiment. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.